Hey guys, this video is for Sophomore US. Make sure you sent me your homework through Jupiter Grades. This is our asynchronous lesson for Wednesday, so make sure you watch this from start to finish. Also, I think some of you did not watch the previous video, so well, most of you did, but a few of you didn't. So, make sure that you watch it from start to finish if you haven't. If you've caught up with the videos, great job. So make sure you listen you listen to those and you listen to this from beginning to end. Okay, so today we're going to continue talking about Andrew Jackson. We're going to talk about the most infamous part of Andrew Jackson's legacy, and that was his treatment of the American Indians. Now, if there's one thing that most people kind of know about Andrew Jackson, apart from that he's on the $20 bill, even if they have a kind of passing knowledge of American history, they know about his horrible treatment of the American Indians. In fact, that's like a cornerstone of the Jackson legacy. His hatred of American Indians was legendary, and that reflected the attitudes of a lot of people of his time and background. He was, a man of the, late 1700s, early 1800s, where he grew up. He grew up in the Southwest, where there was deep animosity toward American Indians. So he kind of reflected a lot of that, I will say it, hatred that a lot of people of his time and background felt toward the American Indians. But I think even with that, it was particularly egregious. His attitudes and his treatment of the American Indians. So it was this combination of Western resentment of American Indians, feeling like they were impediments to white progress, to white expansion. There was some paternalism that Jackson felt toward the Indians. Oh, we have to take care of them, but it was mostly outright hostility. Often when people are prejudiced or hostile to a certain group or groups, there is some paternalistic feeling that, these people are inferior, so we have to look after them. But even implicit in that is racism. Right, because why do you feel you have to look after someone unless you think they're inferior to begin with? Now, some of his pre-presidential career revolved around wars against the American Indians in his area of the country. He commanded the army against the Creek Indians in 1813. There was a lot of American Indian tribes that lived in the southeast part of the country, that lived in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee. That's where Jackson's from. There was a very large American Indian community in those states. And the Creek Indians in 1813 faced Jackson's wrath, where 800 were killed by Jackson and his forces in a battle called Horseshoe Bend, which pretty much ended Creek Indian resistance in Alabama, and actually freed up a lot of land in Alabama to white settlement. Now, faced with this onslaught, of horrible, violent treatment at the hands of white people, a lot of the Southern Indians adopted a policy of assimilation, where the idea was to kind of blend in with American culture, blend in with Southern culture, and that way, if they're seen as just Southerners instead of American Indians, the idea or the hope was that they would actually be treated better. There were 5 tribes in the American South that were known as the 5 civilized tribes, which of course is also very insulting, because that's implying that the other ones are not. But the 5 civilized tribes were the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Creeks, the Seminoles, and the Cherokees. The Cherokees are probably the most famous of all of those tribes. And a lot of those tribes actually adopted white Southern ways. There was a decent amount of intermarriage between white people and of the Southern American Indians. A lot of people in the American South say they have Indian descent, and that it's probably exaggerated, but there's also a lot of truth to it, because there was a tremendous amount of intermarriage, because especially white men and Indian women, because when a lot of white people moved out to that land, and that was often it was frontier land. There weren't many white women. So a lot of white Americans actually married Indian women. So intermarriage was very common. A lot of the Indian tribes adopted white farming methods. And also, there was a decent amount of slave owning in the American Indian tribes. Sometimes people don't talk about that, but the American Indians were slave owners in the South because their attempted assimilation was so deep, their desire for it, that they wanted to adopt as many white ways as they could, and that included slave owning. Like the actor Don Cheadle, if anybody knows who he is, when they look back at his family back, he's African American. When they looked at his family background to try to see, like, who, like, about his slave ancestors, he found out that his slave ancestors actually were not owned by white people. They were owned by the Chickasaw Indians. He was absolutely shocked by that because a lot of people are not aware of the legacy of slave owning in the American Indian community. Now, arguably the most advanced of the American Indian tribes was the Cherokee Indians. Now, they adopted their own written language. They published a bilingual newspaper in both Cherokee language and in English, and there was a significant amount of slave owning as well in the Cherokee Indian community. So the Cherokees are probably the most famous of all of the five civilized tribes. The United States always had very mixed feelings toward the American Indians. There was some grudging respect that some white people actually felt toward the American Indians, especially in earlier times, like in colonial times in the 1700s. They were kind of seen as like noble in their way. Think about it, like half of all the American states, maybe more, like, I could stand here and count, but probably more than half of all our states have American Indian names, which is odd when you think about how the United States government always treated the American Indians, right? But then they're naming their states after them. So that kind of shows like this weird grudging respect that some white people had toward the Indians, but for the and there was also some feeling of paternalism. We have to take care of these people, we're responsible for them. But for the most part, it was outright hostility and violence. White Indian relations were absolutely abysmal, and understandably, considering that white people want their land and the Indians want to protect their land from people they thought were invaders. So violence and hostility, of course, was inevitable, unfortunately. Now, there were some horrendous incidents of mistreatment of the American Indians. Probably maybe talk about this in global, but the British in their negotiations with the Indians actually used to trade blankets with the Indians, and some of the blankets had smallpox on them, so spreading smallpox among the tribes. This is like pure homicidal conduct, right? There was constant warfare, constant land grabs. Americans the white people were generally not keeping their end of the bargain when they were negotiating with the American Indian tribes. Treaties were often signed by deceptive means, serving huge amounts of alcohol, at banquets before they get people to sign treaties, tricking them. A common tactic was to actually try to get an American Indian, like somebody who like represented a minority opinion in the American Indian community, like maybe the few Indians who don't mind white people or like white people, or just are deceptive and just want to just like help themselves at the expense of their people. Sometimes the Americans negotiated with these people who had no legitimacy, but were supposedly negotiating on behalf of their tribe, which often meant that they traded away a lot of their people's land. Now, by the 1820s, let's move back down to the South. By the 1820s, many Southerners viewed the large Indian presence in the South as an impediment to progress. As cotton production, there's a total relationship between cotton production, slavery, and Indian removal, because cotton exhausts, which was by this time was becoming the main crop in the South, exhausts the soil. You can't use the same land over and over again for cotton production. So there was this push by a lot of Southerners to continually move out west in search of new land to actually grow cotton. So because the land they had was exhausted. So they kept moving out west in search of new land, but they were encountering American Indians who owned that land. So their desire to expand the slavocracy, to expand cotton production, ultimately led to the displacement of the American Indians. So there is a total relationship between those three things. Now, negotiations were undertaken by the Monroe and the Adams administration to try to negotiate the American Indian community actually leaving the modern day states of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee. Most of the negotiations were unsuccessful. And the thing is, that was their lives, that was their land. And also a lot of the American Indians had actually, their livelihoods were almost dependent on their close contact with white people, in the sense of they were traders or whatever. So, and who wants to just leave? Right, and go to some strange unknown place, land that was promised to them west of the Mississippi River. So most of the American Indians were not down with the whole idea. Southern states just began taking over Indian land. White people just moved on to Indian land and refused to leave. They were squatters. The American Indians were basically denied any legal protection or standing in Southern court. So, somebody just moved on their land. Some white person just moved to their land, and they really had no recourse. They really couldn't, they couldn't go to court and say these people are moving on my land, because Indians had no standing to act in court. So they were being totally mistreated and abused. But they really had no recourse at all. So it was a really difficult situation. Now, Andrew Jackson supported aggressive Southern action to be taken against the American Indians. So all the aggressive action that was taken by a lot of the Southern states on their own were totally endorsed by Andrew Jackson and his administration. He never recognized the autonomy or the authority of Indian tribes. So basically, these were just, who are these tribes to stand up to the United States government? In 1830, one of the most infamous pieces of legislation ever to pass the United States Congress passed. It was the Indian Removal Act, signed by President Jackson. And the Indian Removal Act forcibly relocated Indians on the east or the southeast in the Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi area, and forced them to land west of the Mississippi. So 110 million acres of land in all were taken for the promise of 32 million acres of land west of the Mississippi, a lot of which land hadn't even been surveyed yet. So where are they moving to? Ultimately, most of the Indians were forcibly relocated to the modern day state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma at this time but in time became Indian territory. It was the place where the American Indians were forcibly relocated from the south to this new land. Interestingly, Indian Removal Act actually passed quite narrowly in the House of Representatives. It passed 102 to 97. So there were even a lot of white people who weren't down with this whole idea of forcible removal, especially people in the Northeast, who tended to have more liberal views on American Indian policy. People in the South, the West, who wanted their land and maybe had heard stories or had bad experiences with American Indians, often had much more aggressive views toward the way we should treat the Indians. Now, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Creek Indian tribes, so those three tribes began to move west. And the Creek Indians were often forcibly relocated in chains as they made the move from their homes to this new Indian territory west of the Mississippi. Now, the Cherokee Indians, who were considered the most civilized of the tribes, resisted removal. And they definitely had been the most assimilated. They felt that they had basically done everything they were supposed to do to blend into American life, and they did not want to leave. So they ultimately took their case to court. The case reached the Supreme Court. And in the case and there were two cases involving the Cherokee Indians, which were actually resolved in their favor. The Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case in 1831, John Marshall, who was the elderly Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, ruled that Cherokees had a right to the land by treaty that they had in Georgia. In probably the most famous case the next year, 1832, Worcester versus Georgia, and you'll be reading all about this in your next homework assignment. The Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had an obligation to protect the American Indians from the state of Georgia that had that was forcibly relocating them. Now, Andrew Jackson apparently said after this decision was reached, and John Marshall made his decision. Now let him go and enforce it. Now, some scholars have said Jackson never said that, but it definitely reflected Jackson's attitude. Remember, Supreme Court decisions are only valid if the other branches of government are willing to enforce them and respect the legitimacy of their decisions, right? And here clearly, President Jackson is not respecting the legitimacy of this Supreme Court decision, and the Supreme Court doesn't have an army, so there we go, right? That means that the decision was not going to be enforced. Now, minor Cherokee chiefs began signing treaties with the United States government, agreeing to relocation. Now, again, a lot of these chiefs did not represent the will of their people. A lot of Americans just, again, found Indians who were willing to deal with, white people who, maybe had some relationship with white people. Maybe they were part white themselves. Maybe they were bribed. So a lot of these so-called chiefs who negotiate with the American government were not really chiefs. They really didn't have they totally didn't have the legitimacy to actually negotiate on behalf of their people. Now, 17,000 Cherokee Indians resisted and refused to move even after these years of relocations in the 1830s, where some agreed to move and some didn't. And ultimately, by 1838, the Cherokees were forced to move. The 17,000 that were left that that had not relocated. And this commenced one of the most infamous episodes in American history, the Trail of Tears. Now, the Trail of Tears was the tragic removal of those 17,000 Cherokees who had resisted and forcibly relocated them to the west. Now, how it went down was horrible. The army escorted these Cherokee Indians off of their land. They were often swindled out of their very few possessions by unscrupulous traders, who promised them, money that they thought they might need in this new place they were going. In exchange for the few things the Indians owned, and they were often, in fact, usually swindled, brutally treated by the members of the army. The Trail of Tears went on for months, and it went through the winter months. And a lot of the Cherokees who were forcibly relocated did not have the clothes or the shoes necessary to actually make the march of hundreds and hundreds of miles to the Indian Territory. Now, a future Confederate colonel, a man who actually fought in the Civil War and witnessed a lot of the brutality of the Civil War, actually said at the end of his life, I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered, but Indian removal was the cruelest work I ever knew. And this was a man who 30 years later was fighting in the Civil War, and he was saying the Indian removal was a lot worse. The general who was in charge of Indian removal was Winfield Scott. I only found that out a few years ago. Winfield Scott is probably a legendary figure in American military history. He was he fought in War of 1812, then later became the commanding general during the Mexican War, then went to politics and ran for president. So Winfield Scott is a prominent first Union commander during the Civil War. So Winfield Scott is a very important figure in American military history, but this is a dark stain on his legacy for sure, that he was actually the commander during the Trail of Tears, even though he would say I was just following orders. And that's a infamous line, isn't it? Now, this march through the winter cold led to up to 8,000 of the Cherokee Indians who were forcibly relocated dying on the Trail of Tears. So that's almost, a third to a half of all the Cherokees who were forcibly relocated died. It was absolutely, absolutely horrible. And Indian Territory, Oklahoma, with modern-day state of Oklahoma, was set up almost like as a virtual dumping ground for the assorted American Indian tribes. Many of them don't have a history together or anything. And this was just kind of the place to put the Indians when they didn't, when they wanted their land and they really didn't know, what else to do with them. It was totally inhospitable land. ultimately, even that was taken from them. In 1889, oil was discovered there, and ultimately Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma. But to this day, a lot of people in Oklahoma have Indian descent because they're descended from, these huge Indian populations that lived there because it used to be Indian Territory. There were other Indian removals that were happening during this time. The Northwest Indians were resisting removal. There was a war in 1832, the Black Hawk War in Illinois, when the Indians who lived there did not want to move. There was a war against them, which brutally put down the revolt. Black Hawk, the Indian chief, was ultimately, the Sac and Fox Indians. That was his tribe. Black Hawk was ultimately captured as a war trophy, which was absolutely disgraceful. The one tribe that basically resisted successfully Indian removal was the Seminole Indians in Florida. Now, this was actually quite amazing. The Seminole Indians who lived in Florida resisted removal, and they had the advantage of the environment they lived in. A lot of them lived in the swampy areas of Florida. They lived in the Everglades, totally inhospitable places for the American army to try to forcibly remove them. So this war against the Seminoles, actually between the United States government and the Seminoles, actually lasts for 5 years. The Seminole Indians actually received a good deal of help from runaway slaves. Some slaves ran away from Georgia, ran into Florida, then hid out with the Indians. The Seminole Indians. There is actually a long history of the Seminole Indians having a relationship with African Americans. In fact, there's a whole group of people called the Black Seminoles. So a lot of blacks lived with a lot of the Seminoles. So the Seminoles were getting help from them, but they basically had the advantage of their environment. And they, for the most part, successfully resisted removal, even though some were removed. But for the most part, they were, they didn't leave, and they were still in Florida. So that's one story, very different from the way the rest of the Indian removal went down. But this is a bitter legacy. Right, and I think it's very important, for people to be, especially young people learning American history, to really know about this, and you're going to be reading about it as well, because we got this nation, we love our country and all of that, but the thing is that we, a lot of the nation we got because the people who originally lived here were swindled out of the land and then forcibly exiled. So it was. It's the ugly truth of American history, the appalling treatment of the American Indians. Unfortunately, the human condition is such that often dominant people feel they can take advantage of weaker people when they want their land and they want their stuff. It's just unfortunately an ugly part of the human story, that often it seems to constantly repeat itself, and the United States government itself was an active ugly chapter in that terrible human story of domination. All right, guys. So remember, I hope you watch this video from start to finish. We're gonna have our live class on Thursday, so I look forward to seeing all of you there. All right, so make sure you're all caught up with all your videos as well. All right, see you on Thursday.